Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of SciChat. My name is Dan Zarella. I am, of course, HubSpot's social media scientist. And this week we're going to be talking about the conversation. And if you know me or know any of my data or have heard me speak before, you know that I have a slightly different take on what it means, what the conversation means, and how important it is, and how we should think about it as scientifically driven marketers in the modern social media marketing space. But before we get into that, I just kind of want to update you guys on how SciChat works, what this whole thing is. SciChat is essentially two things, right? It's a weekly data-based recorded webinar, which you're listening to right now. Which every week we present different data about various topics. And we post them to YouTube and we post them to the Facebook page, the SciChat Facebook group. That is the second part of SciChat, which is in fact the page, which is the community, right? So the first part of SciChat is the content that you're listening to right now. But the second part of it, I think, is actually much cooler, and that's the community that has sprung up around SciChat in its various forms over the past year or so. Now, what that community is it's a collection of a bunch of really smart marketers who are interested in doing marketing and thinking about marketing from a data-backed perspective, from a perspective of the scientific method. How do we take the scientific method and how do we apply that to our marketing efforts, right? How do we differentiate ourselves from what I like to call the unicorns and rainbows marketers, and we'll get into that, and do marketing better through data, through experimentation. All right. And what's awesome about it is that it's a community full of folks like that. So if that's how you think about marketing, if that's you want to bring a little bit more of that kind of thinking into your marketing, or you just want to get better at doing marketing and don't really care about the scientific method one way or the other, that community can help you do that through data, through experimentation, and through a sort of scientific, critical, data-focused mindset, perspective. Now, as I said before, I call myself a social media scientist, and I do this because I think it's an important distinction to make in marketing circles in general, but in social media marketing circles in particular. It's an important distinction to make that there are different ways to think about marketing, right? We can think about marketing in a unicorns and rainbows kind of way, right? So we can just say, oh well, it's social media, so that must mean that we all got to be hippies and sit around and sing kumbaya, and that's an over exaggeration. The reality of it is we can worry about things like only the conversation and being authentic and having a personality and being awesome, and never experimenting, never trying new things is typically what happens there. Uh, versus being a scientist, right? Versus taking actual data, learning, finding actual data about online marketing, finding out how people behave online, and trying to figure out how we as marketers, can leverage those behaviors. What is the data? What does the data say in general? What does the large, big data set say about the way marketing works and can work online? And then more specifically, what does my data say? Right? If you throw away, if you take all the conceptions, the preconceived notions you have about the way marketing should work, right? Like the conversation, for instance. You may have all these ideas, and a lot of folks have, a lot of ideas that the conversation is this sacred element of social marketing that should never be challenged and should never be questioned. But then when you ask them to prove that it works, typically, once you get past the hand waving and umming and ahhing, you'll get some pretty vague, maybe potentially anecdotal evidence of this one time that they engaged with the brand online and it made them want to buy more stuff. And even then, it's usually kind of shaky. And if you go into a lot of examples of people engaging with brands online, a lot of it's just, people complaining and whining about bad experiences, or people trying to get free stuff, or, you know, those sort of interactions that aren't entirely pleasant all the time. And so the conversation, I think, is one of those sacred cows that I really love to look at a little bit more deeply, and to question, it doesn't make sense for us as marketers to chase it as the end all be all of marketing, right? Is conversation the goal, right? Um, and like I said, I do this through data, through science, through experimentation, through research, right? But the kind of research that I'm doing is, and I'm not a big fan of the phrase big data, but that's like the best phrase to use, I guess. It's large data sets, right? And so it's big data sets across multiple industries, multiple time zones, multiple audiences, lots of different kinds of brands, and so I'm presenting with you with what the large scale is, what the 30,000 foot view is, right, of a specific topic, in this case the conversation. While that's great as a starting point, right, that sort of data is great as a starting point to say, okay, well, I'm doing this behavior right now, this, Dan's data suggests something entirely different. That's a great starting point, because that means, okay, I can challenge what I'm doing now with some scientific basis. I'll try the new thing, I'll experiment with it, but at the end of the day, I want to find out what my data says about that new behavior. Right. And if you take what I'm suggesting and you experiment with it, and if you come up with it, it works, then great, keep doing it. If it doesn't, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with you or your audience, or wrong with my data necessarily. It's just that marketing data should be used more in the kind of way that sort of medical data is used, right? Where doctors don't just only use the best practice courses of treatment that have been discovered through research. They try one. If it works, great, on an individual patient, and then if it doesn't, they try the next most indicated course of treatment. And that's really the way that this data should be used, is through experimentation on your own, right? Nothing I say is set in stone. It is all just sort of attempting to bring more science to the topic, bring more data to the topic, and the real end game is always going to be your data, and what your experimentation teaches you about how these tactics work for you. And another thing that I think is important to talk about as we get into talking about the conversation is um, kinds of data, right? And so most of the data that I use, I do use some survey data, but most of the data that I use is observational data, meaning I use public APIs, or, rarely, but sometimes, sort of private data sources, HubSpot data, or from some other company of ours, a friend that's a friend of ours. But for the most part, just public APIs. I look and see what people are doing on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, whatever. And I monitor what people are doing without them knowing that they're being researched on, right? Because what people actually do is a very different thing than what people will tell you that they do, right? And I mean to say that because I want to contrast it with survey data. So if I ask in a survey, do you want to engage in the conversation with a brand? Like if there's a brand that you like or you don't like, right? And you say something about them on Twitter or Facebook, do you want them to respond to you? A lot of people are going to say yes, right? Because it sounds like it's the right answer. And even if you're not like a social media nerd like I am, it just sounds like the right answer. Of course I want them to talk back. I want to feel important and all this kind of thing. But with observational data, what we can do is understand, does it actually matter? Like, people, if you ask people what they think, then they're going to, or what they do or why they do it, they're going to give you these answers that are based on what they want to be true. And the best example of that is, imagine, I'm doing this presentation live and we're in a room full of marketers, and I ask you to raise your hand if you believe you're better than average at your job. Most of the hands in the audience are going to go up. Now, this is not to say that you're not very good at your job. It's just to say that survey data, when used to understand how people behave and why people behave in certain ways, is not always the right thing to do, because people will answer in ways that they want to hear. So if I were to tell you to do a mental test, and in that mental test, what I want you to do, that mental, not test, but experiment, I want you to imagine the top most followed, say 100 or 200, 300 most followed Twitter accounts, right? And I want you to wipe away from that list all the celebrity accounts, like the Bieber and the Lady Gaga and all that kind of stuff, and the Kardashians. Like, just remove them from the list in your mind, and then remove all the accounts that are like big brands, or Southwest Air, JetBlue, or major media outlets, CNN, Mashable. Remove all those accounts. Basically, what you've done is you've removed all of the accounts that were famous because of things other than Twitter, right? They have a lot of followers. They have millions and millions of followers, the accounts that you've removed. They have millions of followers because of things outside of Twitter, right? They're not famous on Twitter because of their Twitter behavior. They're famous on Twitter because of things they did outside of Twitter. What you'd have left, though, would be a very small list of accounts that built enormous reach in the millions of followers based solely on what they do on Twitter. Right. And so here we can understand and we can start to look anecdotally, admittedly, but we can start to form a picture of what kinds of behavior actually lead to accounts building astronomical reaches when we're talking about Twitter, right? Twitter behavior. So if you're McDonald's or a major media brand or major celebrity, it's going to be really easy for you to get a ton of followers, right? That's not whatever you do, you're going to have a ton of followers because you're a celebrity. If you're not famous outside of Twitter, it's going to be much more difficult. And so, what are the behaviors that lead to these accounts getting millions of followers when they're not famous other than Twitter? So you look at breaking news as one example of them. One would be one of the accounts that'd be left there, and all they do is they aggregate breaking news headlines from other mainstream media news sources. It's almost entirely automated. There's no replying. They will tag people. You see @ signs there, but that's only because they're sourcing where they're getting their breaking news from. And so it's all automated. There's very little replying. You look at this example, which I believe is some political type of organization. I'm not entirely sure what it is. But again, they're just pumping out a ton of content, potentially interesting content, and there's no replying. It looks entirely automated to me. It's probably just like a buffer queue or some sort of scheduled posting, maybe some hand posting, but there's certainly no conversation happening here. Again, you have what the F facts. If you go look at this account, it's the similar kind of thing. It's a lot of different. There's some links involved, but it's a lot of just weird snippets of text, of facts that may or may not be true. But again, entirely automated looking. There's not a whole lot of conversation. Another one, OMG facts, very similar to the what the F facts. This one includes a lot of links, but again, it looks highly automated. It's pumping out a ton of content on a very regular basis. There's no conversation happening here, this one has 5 million. All the ones before that had more than 5 million followers. So clearly, it is not engaging in the conversation. It is not being authentic necessarily, right, or being human, or being unautomated, right, or replying to people, being chatty, that has led to these accounts getting a lot of followers. In fact, if I were to ask you to do that same experiment and tell me the account that you can think of that has built massive reach because of replying, I think you'd be at a real major loss to come up with one. Right, and I mean, even if you think about most of the people who, maybe they're comedians, they're content producers, they're folks who, social media personalities who have built some notoriety and some reach on Twitter. A lot of what they're doing, they may also reply, but that's not why they built their reach. The reason that they built their reach is because of the content they're producing. Right, and so the only example that I've ever heard people really come up with to that question is Gary Vaynerchuk, who does have a ton of followers, does a lot of replying. Most of his Twitter use is replying, but you really have to stop and think about the fact. I mean, he owned a successful chain of liquor stores, had a successful web video site, and publishes a bunch of books. So his reach, you can't necessarily blame his reach on replying. But even if I wanted to give you that, you got one example, right? And he certainly doesn't have, in the 5 million, 5.4 million followers like some of these accounts that I was just showing you. And so if we take a step back from Twitter and we jump over to blogging, we can start to dissect this idea of the conversation in a little more broad sense and a little more data backing it up. And so what we have here is I looked at 40,000 blog posts, and I took 3 metrics about those blog posts. I took the number of comments on those blog posts, I took the number of links pointing to those blog posts, and I took the number of views on those individual blog posts, right? And I wanted to find out, does the number of comments on a blog post, i.e. the amount of conversation happening on a blog post, does that correlate? Is it how strongly is it related to the number of links pointing to that blog post, or the number of views that that blog post has attracted? Right? And what I found is actually kind of surprising. These are scatter plots on a logarithmic scale, which is a little nerdy and it's kind of hard to tell. But the numbers, the 0.02 and the 0.04, is what you need to pay attention to. Those are Pearson's correlation coefficient. What that is, that's a measure. You take two numbers, two metrics for like a series of things, like 40,000 posts, and you calculate how correlated they are, right? And how, I mean, that is how strongly related they are. And the way the number works is 0 is no relationship, 1 is a perfect relationship, like inseam size to height. Right, would be it's actually you can have longer legs and shorter torsos and all that kind of stuff, but like leg height to inseam length or something like that would be a perfect relationship. And so 0 would be something completely unrelated to each other, right? The price of tea in China and how long your morning commute took to work. To give a sense of scale, zero point 0.4, right? Remember, it goes from 1 to 0. 0.4 is how correlated SATs, the test, are to college performance, right? And so they're used, but they're not. I mean, and you all know you have your own understandings of how correlated those two numbers actually are. And of course, the scale is actually -1 to 1, but on the other side of the scale, like from -1 to 0, those are inverse correlations, right? So if, as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down, and 1 is a perfect relationship that's inverse, and 0 again is a non-existent relationship. These numbers 0.02 basically indicates that there is no relationship. There's a very, very weak relationship, if there is any relationship, between the number of comments on a blog post and the number of links that were pointed at that blog post. Conversation does not make your blog post more linkable, right? And so generally most marketers, links, incoming links is a great goal they're going after because it can boost your SEO and can boost the number of visits you get from search engines, all that kind of stuff to help you sell product. But there's very little relationship with the comments and links, right? And then you look at comments to views, which is the second graph, and the 0.04 number. The relationship's a little bit bigger, right? Twice as big. But again, it's SAT is 0.4, not 0.04. It's 0.4. This is 0.04, which is essentially, again, there's basically no relationship, no useful relationship between the number of comments on a blog post and the number of times that blog post has been viewed. It just doesn't. A lot of conversation on a specific blog post does not necessarily make that blog post more interesting, right? It might sometimes, infrequently, but it could also just not, right? Like there's no relation, there's no, correlation between a lot of comments and a lot of views. Like there is no connection there, right? And so when we think about the conversation, we need to start understanding that maybe the conversation itself doesn't drive too many other goals, right? So when you're writing a blog post, getting people to view your blog post is a great goal because then you can use CTAs, you can try to do lead generation, you can sell them product, etc. Or getting a lot of links is another great goal because you can use your blog post, you get a lot of links, and then you can get your pages to rank higher in search engines, and you can sell products that way. But comments have a pretty tenuous relationship to these other more bottom line type metrics. But one thing that does have a has a stronger relationship with a bottom line or with a more useful metric is posts per day. So when you look at very popular blogs across the web and you calculate their post per day number, what you find is that as posts per day increases, right? If you, as blogs get very, very prolific, that's when they tend to get a ton of views, right? That's when like a highly, traffic blog goes to like a top blog is when they start really ramping up the amount of content they're producing. So this starts to paint a picture, at least in my mind, and I hope maybe in your mind, that if we have on one hand the idea of conversing, the idea of engaging in the conversation, right? And we have, on the other hand, the idea of broadcasting a lot of interesting content. It may be that broadcasting interesting content is actually more useful to marketers than just engaging in the conversation. As we saw from the Twitter examples, while they're anecdotal, those accounts were broadcasting a ton of interesting content, not engaging in the conversation. And then as we see from the blog data, it is broadcasting posting a ton of interesting content that is what drives views rather than the conversation that surrounds those. And so when we look at Pinterest, we find something interesting. And again, this is the Pearson's correlation coefficient is the vertical axis here. So I just explained 1 is perfect, 0 is non-existent, 4 is about what SATs are, 0.4 is about what SATs are. And here I looked at the correlation between likes on a specific Pinterest post and the number of times that that Pinterest post was repinned, right? So likes is just a sort of measure of approval, and then repinned is actually a sharing mechanism, right? It's very similar to shares on Facebook or retweets on Twitter, right? And you find that it's a very strong correlation there. It's over zero point 0.8, the correlation between likes and repins. What that tells me that the kind of content that would motivate somebody to like it is very similar to the kind of content that would motivate somebody to share it, right? So sharing and liking is very similar kinds of behavior, right? And so as a marketer, of course, you want your content to get shared. That's how you use social media to increase your reach, right? If you're just always posting content to the same people over and over again, then you're never really building reach. You're not using social media to its fullest advantage. But if you can get people to repin it or share it or retweet it, then they're allowing you access to their fan bases and their audiences and allowing you to build your reach. But then when we look at the correlation between comments and repins on Pinterest, while we see the correlation is higher than it was in the blogging example, actually quite a bit higher, it's a little bit over 0.4, it's still significantly lower than the correlation between likes and repins. Now what this tells me is that liking behavior, liking and repinning behavior are much more similar than commenting and repinning behavior, motivations, right? So if I'm going to comment on something, I don't have to agree with it. In fact, it might actually be easier for you to get me to comment on something if I disagree with you. Because if I agree with something you've said or some piece of content you've posted, I might not be all that motivated to comment on it because I don't have anything to add, right? I may share it and show all my friends it because, oh yeah, look, I agree with this. But I'm not going to have anything particularly interesting to add. I'm going to go, oh, good job, right? And like people do that kind of stuff. First post, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, it's a lot easier to get comments on more controversial content. And so you have to wonder, if you are concerned with the conversation, if you're concerned with commenting as a goal in and of itself, you may be best suited to doing different kinds of things, right? You may be best suited to posting more controversial content, right? And in fact, when we look at Facebook, we find that there are very easy ways to drive commenting activity on Facebook. Now, commenting as a goal on Facebook can be useful for different reasons than it is in other media or in other forms of social media. Because on Facebook we have EdgeRank, and EdgeRank values commenting, right? So your EdgeRank score can increase based on increased commenting, right? But as a business goal, the commenting of itself without EdgeRank, I don't think is particularly useful. But on Facebook, it can be. But the point here is, if you want comments, ask questions. It makes sense. Use call to actions for the action that you want, which in this case is commenting. Use a call to action that drives that sort of behavior, which on Facebook is comment, or questions rather. But the problem is when you look at posts that use questions, right? And so what you see here is you see the 3 different kinds of actions you can possibly take on Facebook: likes, comments, and shares on a specific Facebook post. And then you see an action rate, which is essentially the number of, like if it's in the case of likes, it's the number of likes on a specific post divided by the total number of likes for that page. The same thing with comments, it's the number of comments on that post divided by the total number of likes on the page, and shares and so forth. Right? Because I used a very large data set to do this, and I wanted to control for the size of the actual pages themselves, how popular the pages themselves were. So what you find is that the orange bar here are posts that included a question mark. The gray bars posts that did not include a question mark. Posts that included a question mark did in fact get a significant boost in the number of comments on them. But you'll notice they actually got fewer likes and shares. Now, because of the thing that I said about EdgeRank, it can be useful to go after comments on Facebook as a goal in and of itself. However, we have to understand that commenting is not a sign of good content. Commenting is not a sign of content that I'm going to necessarily share or like, or is going to drive sales, or is going to build my reach. Commenting is a very specific kind of behavior that is distinct from the other kinds of behavior. The conversation is something that happens in social media. And if you want to go after that, fine. I'm not going to try to stop you. But you have to understand that that behavior doesn't necessarily tie into the other kinds of interaction that can happen in social media, such as sharing content or simply liking content. And it is those sharing and liking kind of behaviors that do relate to that are more closely correlated with actual bottom line behaviors, so actual lead generation or product purchasing type of behaviors. And as I said, this tells me that, so if you want to drive comments, be controversial, ask questions, right? But if you want to try to increase your reach, increase your sharing, increase the other social media metrics, which, as I said, I believe are more closely aligned with bottom line metrics like ROI and lead generation, those sorts of things, you need to broadcast lots of interesting content. That's the easiest way to do it, is share a ton of interesting content. So what you have here is a graph where I looked at the average tweets per day from millions of Twitter accounts. And I graphed that. That's the blue line there, like the squiggly blue line, and then the darker blue line is actually like it's smooth. It's a rolling average of the light blue line, and the vertical axis there is the average number of followers that those accounts have. And what I found is that followers tend to peak at around 22 tweets per day. And again, there's no like at 24 it doesn't go to zero, right? Like there's a pretty long tail to the right of that graph. What that tells me is that, it's almost impossible to overtweet. So if you're on Twitter and you're trying to build your reach, trying to get more, retweets, that sort of thing, get more followers, it actually is much more important to share lots of interesting content, to tweet a lot, than it is to necessarily engage in the conversation. Because when we look at actual conversational behaviors on Twitter, this is what we find. What I did here is I looked at millions of Twitter accounts and I broke them into two buckets at first, right? The first set of bars, the first orange bar and the first black bar. The first orange bar represents Twitter accounts that have more than 1,000 followers. The first black bar represents Twitter accounts that have fewer than 1,000 followers. So the orange bar is highly followed accounts, the black bar is not that highly followed accounts. Lowly followed accounts. And the vertical axis here is the percentage of their tweets that begin with an @ sign. So essentially how conversational these Twitter accounts are. And what you find is that highly followed accounts, that orange bar, they actually spend a lower percentage of their tweets engaging in the conversation. And then the second set of bars here, the second orange bar and the second black bar, is the same kind of analysis, but with a breakdown at a million. So the orange bar is accounts that have more than 1 million followers. The black bar is accounts that have less than 1 million followers. And again, the vertical axis is still the percentage of their tweets that start with an @ sign. Again, you find highly followed accounts spend a lower percentage of their time engaging in the conversation. Engaging in the conversation is not correlated with building reach. It doesn't build reach. So you may say to me, Dan, what does build reach on Twitter? As I've started to allude to, it is sharing lots of interesting content. So if you do the same breakdown, in which the orange bar represents accounts that have more than 1,000 followers, and the black bar represents accounts that have fewer than 1,000 followers, but the vertical axis here, instead of being the percentage of tweets that begin with an @ sign, this one is the percentage of tweets that do not begin with an @ sign, but do contain a link, basically a measurement of how much interesting content these accounts are broadcasting. You find that highly followed accounts tend to be sharing lots of links rather than engaging in the conversation. They're using Twitter as a broadcast medium, not a conversational medium. And in fact, that's what I believe Twitter is best used for marketing purposes, is as a broadcast medium with a two-way comment functionality built in. Okay. Now, that's not to say that you should never engage in the conversation on Twitter. You should, especially if you have the kind of product or service people are going to often have, customer support questions, and they may tweet about them, or you may have some public relations or press relations kind of behaviors that you need to attend to on Twitter. Totally engage in the conversation, sure, but don't expect that the conversation is the only thing you need to do on social media. If you're interested in building your reach and you're interested in getting dollars and cents value out of your social media efforts, you need to focus on posting a lot of interesting content and working for behaviors that are not just commenting, not just conversing, because those behaviors are very different than the behaviors that will produce those bottom line results for you. So as an example, or to keep that picture growing, what we find here is that if you look at non-retweeted tweets, that's the pie graph on the left, you find that just under 25% of them contain a link. But if you look at retweeted tweets, you find that over 50% of them do contain a link. Right? So links, people like retweeting links because it's just, I want to share links rather than, links are a little easier to motivate me to share than it is to, you have to say something really, really funny in 140 characters that I'm going to retweet it. But a link, because I feel like I'm sharing something of more value. Right? And so I'm a little more apt to do that. And in fact, when we, look at the sweet spot, basically, what percentage of my tweets containing a link should I aim for to get the most retweets. That's what this graph is here. You find that accounts between 60 to 80% of their tweets are links. Those accounts get the highest number of retweets per tweet. Right? It's not the ones that reply the most, because when you do that kind of analysis for replies instead of links, you find that basically as the number of times, as the percentage of your tweets that are replies increases, your retweets per tweet decreases. Right? So not only does spending all your time in replying not get you a lot of followers, but it doesn't get you a lot of retweets either. And it is, in fact, sharing a lot of links, sharing a lot of interesting content, using Twitter in a more of a broadcast medium. That is what gets followers. That is what gets retweets. And, at the end of the day, we have to remember this, too, as a content creators, that when I looked at retweet data, I found that in my data set, I had hundreds of thousands, actually millions in this particular one, of tweets, and of the retweeted tweets, of those tweets that did get one retweet or more, right? 14.64% of them were never clicked on, right? So of the links that were retweeted, of the link-based tweets that were retweeted, 14% of them, almost 15% of them, had never been clicked on. That means that there's a significant percentage of retweeting behavior that's happening outside of clicking behavior. In fact, 16% had more clicks than retweets, right? So 14% had 0 clicks, but 16% had more clicks than retweets. Meaning, I'm going to make my decision about this, or there's a good chance that the people who are making the decision about retweeting your content are doing so based only on the content itself, not necessarily on what's behind the link. So as content producers, when we're interested in sharing a ton of interesting content, when we're interested in broadcasting a bunch of the stuff that we've created, the media, the offers, whatever, we really need to think about the headline, right? And we really need to think about what's the short soundbite that's going to accompany it. Because if people aren't going to necessarily click and the conversation isn't going to correlate a whole lot to this, then it's all about that headline, at least at first. Right? So you really need to work on about sharing interesting content, a lot of it, right? That's really the key, because once you start increasing the frequency of the content you're sharing, then you can get into experimenting with a lot of this other stuff. So, but two takeaways here is, rather than engaging in the conversation, really work on nailing your headlines and sharing a ton of interesting content. So that's this week's SciChat. Thank you everybody for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.